Engage your brain and enter the mind's eye. I'm your host, Brian Turnov, and you're listening to Z Talk Radio. It's February 18th, 2016, and it is almost 140 years to the day when a man was born who would change and impact the way that we live today. His name was Edgar Cayce, a man who has been nicknamed the Sleeping Prophet, the father of holistic medicine, and the most documented psychic of the 20th century. For more than 40 years of his adult life, Cayce gave psychic readings to thousands of seekers while in an unconscious state, diagnosing illnesses and revealing metaphysical truths to so many. Then, in 1931, Edgar Cayce agreed to help a group of people grow spiritually and become more psychic, with one condition. They would have to live these precepts. It took the group about 11 years to apply and compile the 24 lessons that became A Search for God. Since then, the material has helped individuals and groups around the world to discover a closer attunement to God. Tonight, that's what we're going to do. We speak with Karen Boldt Leigh Hronek of the Association for Research and Enlightenment, the nonprofit organization founded by Cayce in the same year of 1931, and the same organization who runs the study groups. Links for both guests are up right now on our website, themindseyemedia.com. Again, that's themindseyemedia.com. On the other side of the break, we're talking reincarnation, dreams, ESP, psychic phenomena, and spiritual growth, all while we do our own little investigation and search for God. This is The Mind's Eye, and we'll be right back. Let's welcome tonight's guest, Karen Boldt Leigh Hronek of Edgar Cayce's Association for Research and Enlightenment. Thank you guys so much for joining me on The Mind's Eye tonight.
You're welcome.
Tonight we're talking about Edgar Cayce, who is considered to be one of the most well-documented psychics of the 20th century. Obviously, all three of us are pretty well acquainted with the man, but for those who are not, Karen, do you mind just telling us who Edgar Cayce was?
Yes. Edgar Cayce was born in the late 1800s and passed in the right after the beginning of World War II. And he is known as the Sleeping Prophet, and also one of the father of holistic medicine. He found out as a young boy that he had the ability to sleep on his books, on his school books, and he was able to recall all the information that was in those books, and realized that he had a gift. And as he got older, he asked that he use this gift in order to help others, and eventually found his gift as a psychic, and would put himself into what he called a trance, and connect with the source. And he was often directed by someone, would ask him questions, and then he would respond. And that is what is known as a reading. And the Association of Research and Enlightenment is the holder of over 14,000 of those readings that he gave over his lifetime, that cover a vast number of topics.
And before you touched on briefly, his nickname is the Sleeping Prophet, something that he picked up younger in life, an aspect of it. Why was he? Tell us a little bit more about the process, I guess, so to speak. How did he do what he did?
Well, he explained it in several of the readings, because that was actually a question that was asked. How did he do this? And he said that he would lie down, and that he would ask to be connected to the source, and that actually he would see a stream of light, and that he would connect with that light, and that he was able to obtain information of what the readings also refer to as the Akashic Records, which is the information of everyone's life, both past and present and future. And when the question was asked, in the sleeping state, he was able to give information, particularly detailed medical information. He never went further than, I believe, the 8th grade, and yet he was able to, when asked questions about what was wrong with a certain body, would go into great detail about anatomy and would talk about what to do to restore the body to wholeness, and to talk about things that only somebody with a medical degree would be able to understand, and he, in a normal state, would not be able to explain it either.
So when he woke up, he really pretty much had no idea of what was said during these readings. And before,
correct.
And before,
he had no memory of what had occurred, and if you had read it back to him, he wouldn't have been able to explain particularly a lot of the medical information. Now, he made a lot of biblical references, and he was a devoted reader of the Bible and read the Bible every year through for each year of his life, I think starting at the age of 14. So he probably could go into great detail about any of the biblical references, but if you had asked him, about a medical diagnosis or, anything else that he may have said about a past life, because he talked a lot in some of the readings about past lives, he wouldn't be able to recall it.
Before, when we were talking about what he attributed his powers to, you said the source. Do you mind defining that a little bit more, or at least what did he consider to be the source? Was it a god? Was it something else? What was this source?
I believe that he would say that it was God or the Christ consciousness. He referred a lot to the Christ consciousness, which is different than what some people would refer to as Christianity. He made a vast difference between Jesus the man and the Christ, that Jesus became the Christ. I think that he was very specific about oneness. That was a great theme throughout his readings, as well as in the study group readings, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so there was no, it was God, the divine. He did refer to a God consciousness, the oneness, the source of all. So it wasn't defined in terms of a religious sort of connotation that we would have today.
When we think of mediums and psychics and people who legitimately have this skill or this power, the source of it, the origin of it, can be varied. It's almost like a superhero in the sense that, some superheroes were born with the power, others were an accident happened, or they were made into it. Was Edgar Cayce, or did Edgar believe that he was born with this ability? Was it given to him? Did an accident occur that somehow attributed to it? Where did he think this power came from? Was it God given, or was he somehow made with it into it?
I think that he probably would have said, that it's it's twofold. Everyone is psychic, and he said that you are your own best psychic, and that's why it's so important for you to know yourself first. And that's actually one of the chapters in the study group readings as well. And I think that he would also say that it was because he was open to serving, and that he was willing to do the work that was required to access that source. And the study group readings were actually a process of people coming to him and saying, "How do you do this?" And he came back and said, "Well, everyone can do it, but there are steps that you have to take, and if you're willing to take those steps, you could do this as well."
We're gonna talk about the study groups, and I'm sure our listeners, their ears perked up when they heard, oh, I have the chance to at least learn about becoming more psychic. I'm sure their ears perked up a little bit, but we're gonna hold that to the end. I want to talk a little bit more about Edgar Cayce, but before I do, I want to get a little bit of your personal experiences. Leigh, tell us a little bit about how Edgar Cayce came into your life.
So I was in a used bookstore in New York City and picked up a book called Many Mansions by Gina Seminari. And I just was so intrigued by the material that she made reference to Edgar Cayce, and I was coming back to Virginia Beach. And as soon as I came home, I found out that there was a study group a couple blocks from where I was living, and that's how I started my journey.
What about you, Karen? How did Edgar Cayce come into your life?
Well, I actually answered an ad in the classifieds for there was an opening at the spa. I had been working with a teacher who knew about the Edgar Cayce Center and had mentioned, a couple of times to some of the principals and things because she had worked with them before. And I was in transition in terms of jobs, and she said, we just, open up the paper and say a prayer and choose something. And I happened to find the health, I think it, at that point was called the Health Center, so I really didn't even know what it was. But I applied for the job, and 13 years later, I'm still here.
Edgar Cayce, it's amazing how much of a profound impact Edgar Cayce still has on us today in little ways, like working for the Association for Research Enlightenment, or for someone like me who's just fascinated by him. And then, of course, there are his health readings that have impacted people to this day. And he was really ahead of his time. I'm a big fan of Edgar Cayce. I'm an ardent believer. But at the same time, like everything, I also try to look at it both skeptically and as a believer. Many of his readings that deal with the fantastical, or I guess so to speak, the metaphysical parts are really hard to prove. So I always try to stick with what's real, what can we prove. But the readings that are undeniable are his health readings, many of which doctors are using today. He really did earn the name the father of holistic medicine. He was a bit of a man before his time. Talk about his skills in that department, because I feel that is the most undeniable aspect of his readings.
Well, it's really interesting that you should say that, because coming from the background that I did in terms of starting at the spa, I was familiar with the health readings first, and I saw the actual the results of people using those recommendations and applying those principles. And so it was a much easier jump for me to then go into the spiritual material, because I knew that what I had seen in the physical was true. And so when I first started studying the material and the study group readings, so much of this now is being proven in terms of the spiritual aspect, and a lot of what he gave in terms of particularly the study group lessons are really life lessons. They're about, Mark Thurston used to say, they're about character development. And they've proven so many of these things now in terms of how the brain works and in terms of psychology and group psychology, that he really was ahead of his time in a lot of these aspects too. Particularly a lot of the positive thinking that we're all so familiar with nowadays, and how thoughts are things, and how they actually occupy space and can create things outside of us. And so it's very interesting to see how some of these readings, other than just the health readings, are being documented and are being validated as well.
Yeah, he really showed us the psychosomatic importance of health, and how that there is that connection between the health, mental health and physical health. It really amazes me how accurate he was, and that's what makes me think, like you, that, well, if he could be very accurate, so accurate on his health readings, well, then maybe there's probably a good chance that at least some, maybe if not all, is true about the metaphysical parts. What about his family? I would imagine that must have been pretty tough to deal with in both positive and negative way. What did his family and close friends feel about his gifts?
Well, his older son, Edgar Cayce, who was actually involved in rejuvenating the site here in Virginia Beach, in the original hospital building that we're actually talking to you from right now, used to say that it was a great thing and a horrible thing to be his son. Because of course, one of the ways that Edgar Cayce became famous was the healing of Hugh Lynn's eyes. He was a photographer before he gave himself over to becoming a full-time, devoting himself to the readings full-time. And Hugh Lynn, who I believe was about, was very young, 8, probably at the time, 6, 7, 8, had actually gotten into some blasting powder because that was what they used for flashes at the time, and had actually blinded himself. And the doctor said that he was going to lose his sight at least in one eye, if not in both eyes. And he asked his father to give a reading, and his father gave a reading and for some internal applications as well as some external things, some packs and things for his eyes. And he was cured. And so, it was great in that aspect, but then he said, he knew absolutely everything that I did. There were no secrets, which was somewhat difficult for, a boy in high school. And I think the same was in terms of his circle, which the study group became a circle of friends and colleagues who are experimenting with this material as well. And we often talk about it in our study group and in prayer group, how awesome, and I use that term literally, it must have been to have access to him, to be able to ask him a personal question and have a response. And how powerful that must have been, and yet how challenging that must have been as well for him, in allocating his time, and they were people, so there were jealousies and there were factions and and things just as we have today in groups, which is why I think that the study group readings are so fascinating in terms of the group dynamic. If you do nothing but study the people that were involved in that first group and how they were able to take 11 years of their lives and devote it to this man and this work, it's quite impressive.
It's interesting that you think how someone with such a gift can also be a bit divisive in that sense to even his friends and his closest friends and family. That's a bit of a microcosm of what humans are and almost what we do. When we have such a great gift, we sometimes can turn into a negative thing. And before you said it was interesting that you have access for his family and close friends to this, and it made me think, what's one question that, if you were to have a reading by Cayce, Leigh, what question would you ask? Have you ever thought about that?
No.
Or you're just not, I don't think you're telling us, really.
It's like it's trying to distill down to one question would be the big challenge for me.
What about you, Karen? Is there anything that you could think of? Have you ever thought about what reading you would get, or what question you would ask?
I think that I would probably want a past life reading. I think that those are fascinating, and it probably would explain a lot of the questions that I have about my family and relationships that I have.
And the thing about Edgar Cayce is even today I'm still surprised of how little known he is, but during his lifetime, he was actually fairly well known. I believe there was a 1910 New York Times article written about him, a pretty substantial article, and I mean, New York Times is a pretty reputable newspaper. I would imagine he would have had a lot of people coming after him. Did he do a lot of readings for celebrities and important people?
Well, the readings are protected by numbers. So some of the readings that we have in the vault, we don't actually have proof of who. There's speculation, but we don't have proof of who they were. And I think that he was very well known at the time. There was an article written about him in, I believe, Coronet magazine, which is a nationally known magazine. And during the time, this was during World War II, and so he actually got much more of an influx of just the general public wanting to know about their loved ones and where their loved ones were and whether or not they were alive. And that is what some people believe may have actually led to his decline, because he initially agreed and was told in a reading that he should only perform, I think it was 2 to 4 readings a day. And as he was getting all of this mail, he was getting tens of thousands of letters. Just, that was when people wrote letters instead of email, and so they just had bags and bags of letters delivered. And so he was giving up to 8 to 10 readings a day at one point. So there's speculation that there were celebrities that he gave readings to, but he was far more, and that's what I meant when I said earlier about his dedication, and that he was willing to serve. He wasn't looking for the limelight. He wasn't looking to be, the Hollywood astrologer to the stars or, that sort of thing. He was wanting to help the person in the Midwest who was looking for her son during World War II and wanted to know if he was going to be found, and whether or not she was going to be able to, bury his body here in the United States. So his devotion and his service in terms of what he gave during the readings, I think, was what set him apart from many others.
And I can't imagine how inundated he must have been with so many readings, because he was famous. And at the time, like you said, we were going through World War I, World War II. So, I mean, people were just... And as being someone who looked at life like he was meant to serve, that was his life purpose, imagine it would have been so hard for him to turn people down. You mentioned that he was a Christian. He was pretty hardcore Catholic. He's helping people, but
he actually wasn't Catholic.
Oh, I apologize.
He was a version of a Presbyterian. He actually was a long-time member of the Presbyterian Church here in Virginia Beach. Although he said that the Catholic Church was very good for some people. So again, he never distinguished between denominations. He always said the best religion is one that you'll actually practice. So it was actually a reading that he gave.
So he was a devout religious man, and
yes.
he did the readings on health and helping people, but at the same time he also had these, I guess what would be considered fantastical elements of his readings, reincarnation, past lives, dreams, ancient mysteries. How was he able to reconcile the two, because they would be conflicting at different points?
In some ways, they were very shocked and reticent to accept some of the information that they were given at first, particularly the past life readings. And he also gave a series of readings on the Bible and on Jesus who became the Christ. And coming from the background that he came, he had a very difficult time reconciling some of the things that were said in the readings in terms of what he had been taught in a more religious, strict religious background, particularly reincarnation, which is also interesting, we now find is actually some biblical scholars believe that Jesus taught reincarnation, so I've gone back to some texts. So again, some of the things that he talked about, even on that metaphysical level, are now being proven. Some of the things that he talked about, they've done archaeological studies, and some of the information that he gave about the Essenes in the Bible and things of that nature have been proven and documented as well. So I think at first there was some difficulty reconciling, but I think that, as we talked about before, there was such truth in the physical readings, and then again as they came together about these group readings that they got, that I think that they eventually had a trust in the source more so than anything else, that what was coming from that source was the highest good. And so they were willing to work with it, if not accept it right away.
He had this trust in the source, but was there ever a time that he doubted himself, the source, and his own abilities?
I don't think that there was ever any doubt in the source. I think that and that's what these study group readings are also do so beautifully, is that he, of course, had doubts. He was a human being. He was a person, and he had challenges, just as we all do in this physical world. He wasn't good with money. He was a chain smoker, but back in the day, of course, that was looked on a little bit differently, but he didn't like to follow the dietary guidelines that were given in the readings. So, he was a human being, and so he struggled with even the things that he knew that he was supposed to do. And so I think that one of the most succinct and beautiful readings that I always come back to is, he always says, and I actually have a bag that this is on. It's not actually, the quote actually isn't given to him, but I think a lot of people will know it. He said, "Why worry when you can pray?" When you can't pray, that's when you should worry. And so I have all in my office where I've gotten these things that now say, "Pray more, worry less." So there are these things that we've picked up on subconsciously, because they are a part of this God consciousness that he was able to tap into. And that's why it resonates with so many people on so many different levels, is because there's a truth to it. There's a universal law and that's what the study group readings really are about. There are universal laws that we have here that we have to follow in order to obtain spiritual growth. And we don't have to follow them because we have free will, and we can choose not to, but we know that they're there. And I think that he would say, if I can humbly try to decipher what he would say today, is that actually this is a quote as well, just keep trucking. Keep on trucking. You have to just, day by day, step by step, make progress. And there will be some doubts along the way, and you just move through them. And he also used to say, it doesn't matter whether you move forward or backwards, the thing is that you have to move. And so I think that that's what I admire most about him, was his perseverance and his persistence. And because he didn't have an easy life, people, I guess, would come here and see this monument, I suppose you would say to him, and this organization that he founded, and think that his life was an easy one, but it wasn't. So we all have challenges, and we all have the choice in how we choose to meet those challenges.
I'm glad you brought up some of your favorite quotes here. I think one of my all-time favorite quotes, "Today's dreams are tomorrow's answers." And I really do firmly believe in the importance of dream and dream interpretation. I don't think there's anything paranormal. I don't think there's anything supernatural aspected. I think it's your brain communicating with you and giving you the clues and hints on really what you feel inside. Did Edgar Cayce have a similar belief to that?
I think he said that you would you would always be told of anything of importance in a dream. You would be foretold of anything of importance in your life in a dream. So he thought that they were very important. It was very important to catalog your dreams, to write them down so that you remembered them, because, as you said, and again, we keep going back, and I think that it's Carl Jung would talk about your dream life and your subconscious, and so we do know in psychology now that your dream life is actually very important, and it's the time when your brain is actually processing things. And although Cayce would take it a step further and say that it's actually your superconscious trying to communicate with you, your spiritual self trying to communicate with you and help you make decisions on this physical plane. He actually documented and had a couple of readings about his dreams that he thought were of importance as well. So I think he thought that they were very important. But he was also very wary about making sure, and this is the information about knowing yourself, is that dreams are very specific. And although there are symbols and symbology, what a lion means to one person may not mean the exact same thing to the other person. So it's very important that you make sure that that you're interpreting them through your lens, as opposed to trying to fit them into any sort of mold.
Dreams are extremely subjective, and to be able to interpret them, you have to understand what's going on in your life right now. And we're going to talk a little bit more about just shortly his readings, but before we talk a little bit about that, as we said before, he was very well known at the time, and he was even studied by science, by doctors at the time. What were their conclusions? Did they deny him outright, or did they actually say this person, Edgar Cayce, has a true gift?
I think that it would probably vary depending on who did the study. He originally, when he first discovered this talent, he had actually gone under hypnosis. He had laryngitis and had gone under hypnosis and found that he was able to diagnose himself. And so that was actually quite well documented in the papers and things. I think he was in Ohio at the time. I can't recall exactly. But so there was a flurry at that time. And then there were doctors and things that were wanting to study him. And he didn't have anyone at that time who was really protecting him. And so they would do things like stick him with pins and, to see if he was faking this state. And so he found that he was actually being abused in some way, and so that's when his family and eventually his wife came in and became much more protective of his gifts. And he was studied. He had several relatives actually that were doctors, and who couldn't deny the actual reading. There was never any denial as to this. Yes, this is the correct diagnosis, and this is what needs to be done. Or, sometimes the things that he said needed to be done, the doctors actually said would harm the person, and then they actually did them and found out that they didn't. So there was some doubt there, but the majority of the physicians of his time, if they were given the documents that he was producing, said that they were legitimate, but they didn't believe that he was getting them the way that he said that he was. So there was always some doubt in terms of the medical profession about that.
Karen, is there let's talk about the readings for a few minutes, and then we're going to talk about the A.R.E. and, of course, what you guys came here to talk about, which is the book and the study group's A Search for God. Karen, is there a particular subject of the readings that really fascinates you more so than others?
I am particularly fascinated. There's two subsets. I really he gave a series of readings that have been condensed into a subset that's called Jesus the Pattern, that talked about the teachings of Jesus and a lot about healing and just how we should how we should interact with one another. So that's always fascinating to me. And then the other one goes along with some of the psychology and some of the things that we were talking about before. He did quite a bit in terms of attitudes and emotions and how those actually affect your health and your well-being as well, and how that your thoughts and the emotions that you choose to express actually have an effect on your psychological health as well as your physical health. And so that's really, and he gives tools which I think come into play in the study group readings as well, as to how to deal with, what those attitudes and emotions are about, and gives you tools to deal with those sort of things.
Well, what about you, Leigh? Is there a particular reading or a subject that truly fascinates you from Edgar Cayce?
Yes, I enjoy the readings that deal with the life of Jesus and his experience in the earth when he became the Christ. Those just really touch me. And I also like the readings that talk about dreams and dream interpretation. I always find those so hopeful and helpful.
Was there something about Jesus Christ that you found out through Edgar Cayce which you never heard of before?
I think it was the idea that he wasn't born and existed in just that one lifetime, that this was a continuation of a soul showing the way and perfecting himself through obedience of the law until he became Christed, and then being told that is our mission in a sense as well. And I think that's the part that touches me, is that I'm constantly reminded through the readings that I too can do even as he.
It's almost like a quote that it reminds me of. Why don't put your heroes on a pedestal, because then you can't. That takes away from the fact that you can do exactly what they can do.
Yeah.
And with Jesus, you touched on a really important or a big part of his readings was the reincarnation. Are we always going to reincarnate, or is there ever going to be a point of I guess kind of what Buddha would say, or enlightenment, where we can move past this cycle? Or are we always just, I don't want to say doomed to reincarnate, but are we always just bound to reincarnate?
Well, we actually have a field conference that Charles Thomas, who is Edgar Cayce's grandson, gives, that's called Reincarnation Unnecessary, with a question mark. And we do know that there are some souls that eventually, as you said, reach that enlightenment and don't have to return. And the readings also talked about people who have reached enlightenment but have chosen as their soul path to come back until everyone returns. So, and that's something in the readings as well, is that we're told that, we're all in this together. That we aren't going to reach that state of enlightenment until we all reach it together. And so we do have that sense of a responsibility to each other and that sense of oneness. And, some people think it's a little frustrating because they feel like they have to drag others along with them. But I think it's more in terms of the Cayce readings, that you're really we're each here to be an example to ourselves, but also to others, to uplift them, not to have to do it ourselves, but to allow them to look at us as an example on how to uplift themselves individually and then collectively.
Is there anyone claiming to be Edgar Cayce right now, the reincarnated version?
Always at least a couple of people who claim to be Edgar Cayce reincarnated. And he actually gave, I think it's 2 or 3 questions. He actually, I guess, foresaw that this would happen, and actually left, I believe, 2 or 3 questions that he instructed that anyone who came back and said that they were him be asked. And so far, those questions have remained unanswered by anyone who has made that claim. So,
Do you know what the questions are, or can you not really say? Because...
No, we just...
You know, I had to ask. It's my responsibility as the host, of course. So I would be remiss if I didn't ask those questions. All right, well, we're going to take a break in a couple minutes, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the A.R.E. and, of course, the Search for God study group. But before we do, just one last question on the readings. I think it's really appropriate that I believe his first and last readings were actually on himself. The first one was to, I believe, cure his partial paralysis of a throat issue that he was having, and then the last one he did a reading on himself. Do you guys know what the last reading said?
You know, I don't know that. I'm sure that it probably was a reading about his health and how they might be able to aid him. I believe he was having some issues with some strokes and things at the end of his life. So my guess is that probably was what the reading was and how to help him best transition.
And before we take this break, is there hundreds of books have been, publications have been written on him. Would you say that there's one more so than others that you would recommend? Thomas Aguru's There Is a River. What book would you recommend for the listener who is really just getting their feet wet with Edgar Cayce right now?
I think There Is a River is a nice way to start with the autobiography to find out a little bit more about him. But the readings were so vast, and you can find just about anything that you might be interested in terms of a topic, probably found in the readings. So what I typically suggest is if you're interested in dreams, or if you're interested in prayer, or if you're interested in meditation, that you go directly to the readings and try to find some information on that subject matter. And more than likely, we have a book that's been written on that topic as well that sort of gives you a combination of the readings and an interpretation. And that usually is a good way to get your foot wet because it's something that you're already familiar with, the topic, and it just gives you a little bit of a slant on what Edgar Cayce said about it.
All right, let's take that quick break for a moment. When we come back, we're going to do our own search for God. We're here with Association for Research Enlightenment's Karen Boldt and Leigh Hronek. We'll be right back in a Mind's Eye moment. We're back on the Mind's Eye with Karen Boldt and Leigh Hronek of the Edgar Cayce's Association for Research and Enlightenment. And of course, the reason why I invited both of you on was to talk about the all-important study group and the book A Search for God. But there's really no way we can talk about that without setting up what the A.R.E. really is. So before we talk about the study group, tell us a little bit about the history of the Association for Research and Enlightenment. When did it open its door? And obviously, what was the main goal of it?
Well, the A.R.E., the Association for Research and Enlightenment, actually started back in the late 20s, and it was a group, I think it was called, it had a different name, a slightly different name, and it was a group of Edgar Cayce and some of the people around him who were really interested in researching the topics that were coming up in the readings. And so it started out as a membership organization, which it still is today, and a nonprofit, and it really was created to sort of support Edgar Cayce and his desire to continue with the readings. And it exists today. We have a headquarters here in Virginia Beach, Virginia, which is open to the public, and we provide all sorts of free classes and courses as well as conferences here. And then we also have regional offices in the field. We have a center in Texas. And then we also have field conferences throughout the United States, as well as in other countries where people get together and talk about different topics in the readings.
And I have visited both the Virginia Beach, the main headquarters, and I recently went to the New York headquarters.
Wonderful. Oh, that's right. I'm sorry. I always forget. There's also a center in New York City.
Yeah.
I believe it's in Manhattan.
Yeah, how dare you? Forget about that, especially because I'm in New York. It's right near Penn Station, and I actually went to a study group. It's fascinating stuff, and we'll get back to that shortly. Anyone, just give out the social media information for the A.R.E. so they can visit it while we're talking about it.
The website is Edgar Cayce, which is EDGAR. KCCAYCE.org, and that is our main landing page, and you can find about any topic that you can find just about any topic or any service, and you can also find tools and conferences and things in your area. And then, of course, we also have a web page for the study groups where you can locate study groups in your area as well.
I had a great time when I visited the A.R.E. in Virginia Beach, and I really highly recommend it for anybody, whether you're an Edgar Cayce fan or not. They have so many different parts and so many interesting aspects to it. I'm so jealous of you guys. I think I had a couple favorite parts when I visited. When was it? It was 2 summers ago, I believe I visited. You have the Stone Labyrinth, which I just absolutely love walking. I'm just so jealous of the fact that you guys get to walk that every day, or at least have the option of walking that stone labyrinth every day. Of course, there's the meditation room, which can quiet any mind. And then, of course, how can you forget the readings? The reading room. Anyone who wants to read take a look at the readings, and that's almost 15,000 of them, you can just pop down there for free and take a look. Is there a certain part of the headquarters that you just find yourself gravitating toward? Let's start with Karen there.
The whole campus is really beautiful. It's right on the ocean front, and Edgar Cayce, picked the location, Virginia Beach itself, for its healing properties. We're right where we buttress up against a state park, so even though we're in a residential area, we have a vast area of natural wildlife, and then we have the ocean. I love the meditation room, just as you mentioned before, but there are so many peaceful and calm places here on campus that you can find, even if you're not interested in the readings. It really is a place where I think you can come and really feel healed.
Well, what about you, Leigh? Is there a certain room that you gravitate toward?
Well, I, in the past, used to love the meditation garden. There's a little pond there with the fish in it, and there's bamboo nearby. It's just gorgeous and very restful and peaceful. And I'm like with Karen, the meditation room, I can go in there and just soothe the savage beast immediately. Yeah.
That's a really funny way of putting it, soothe the beast. I might steal that from you, Leigh. So, and another part, there's so many beautiful paintings up around the A.R.E., and if I do recall correctly, which I so rarely do, so definitely correct me if I'm wrong, going into the meditation room, I believe on the top level, there are paintings, and they are, I believe, the reincarnated lives of Edgar Cayce and I believe his wife Gertrude, and I think they were done by Ingo Swann, the famous remote viewer. Am I right there?
Yeah, they do. Their life seals that he created for them. That was a specific reading where he would go back into past lives that were important, and then there were several people that had life seals created by him. And then also people had other artists create interpretations of important lifetimes and different symbols from those lifetimes.
Boy, would I love to get one of those hanging on my wall right now. I won't lie to you. Before we talked about how one of the goals for the A.R.E., the Association for Research and Enlightenment, is researching the subjects that Edgar Cayce talked about in his readings. What are some of the past projects that the A.R.E. has worked on, and what do we see in the future there?
They've just started actually doing what they used to do, I believe, back in the late 60s and the early 70s, where they're actually having some of the membership experiment with some of the readings and different materials, and then coming back and giving feedback on subjects such as the dreams, daily meditation and prayer. And then in the past, they have done, and they continue to do, not the association itself, but other organizations continue to do research in terms of the physical readings and doing experiments with that sort of thing. And then we also have Mark Thurston, who used to head the Atlantic University here, is now at George Mason University, and actually uses some of that material, the Cayce readings, and some of the work that he does in terms of conflict resolution and also group dynamics and some group psychology things that he does as well. So there's some material being researched. But in general, we ask that the membership and just the public in general do their own research, and we're always welcome and open to feedback that they have.
I believe the A.R.E. has been associated with multiple archaeological digs over the time. I don't know if they're particularly the ones who fund it, but it seems that they're associated with some level, particularly in Egypt. Do you mind talking about some of the archaeological digs there and maybe elsewhere around the world?
Well, that is John Van Auken's bailiwick. I do know that we do archaeological research, that we actually have some donors that are very generous in terms of grant money. They've done studies in Bimini as well as in Egypt in terms of some of the readings that he gave about the times in Egypt as well as in Atlantis. But John Van Auken, or one of the other speakers, would be much more better equipped to talk about that aspect of it.
What did Edgar Cayce say about Egypt? Who built the pyramids?
That again is not my strong suit. I do know that the original, that there was a group of souls, particularly around him, that were in the study group as well as the prayer group, that had a life in Egypt, and he talked a lot about that. It was the time of Rata was the incarnation of Edgar Cayce, and he talked a lot about their healing work and how they worked together as a group on some of the spiritual laws and principles. But that's more of my expertise as opposed to the actual the information that he gave about Egypt in general.
And he talked a lot about Atlantis too. Didn't he say that there was a connection between the Sphinx and then Atlantis as well?
There is some sort of connection between the Egyptian lands and Atlantis, according to the readings. I'm not really sure exactly what that is, but I know there is a connection.
All right, well, let's talk about our main dish, really why we invited you on here to talk about, of course, the A.R.E. study groups for the book, A Search for God. Tell us a little bit about the history and background of the study group. When did it start, and really what's the point?
Well, this group started back in 1931. It was it's actually at a low point in terms of Edgar Cayce's life. They had just lost the hospital. It was right after the beginning of the Great Depression. Right. And this group of people that had gathered around him, they had a weekly sort of discussion group, and they asked him if they could continue that even though the hospital was closed. And in the lore of study groups, we say that this group of people got together because they were being altruistic and wanting to know how to do what he did. We have Hugh Lin in audio tapes giving several lectures where he talked about, well, actually, a lot of them were just hoping that they were going to get one more reading from him, that they would be singled out in the crowd. And so a group of them gathered, and for what they thought might be the last time, and from that came this really beautiful reading about cooperation and how that they had agreed as a group in a previous incarnation to come together again and to study this material. And from that, and they were told that the source would guide them and lead them through these lessons, and that they would not be allowed to move forward until everyone in the group understood the lesson that they were studying, and it actually took them close to a year before they were allowed to move on with cooperation.
Wow.
So that's the first chapter, the first lesson that was given in the Search for God series.
Are there any surviving members? I know it was 1931, but there's a chance, I guess, some of them could still be alive.
We have June Bro, who is Harmon Bro, who also studied Edgar Cayce during his lifetime. He was, I believe, getting his PhD in psychology at the University of Chicago in Illinois, and came down, and that eventually started a friendship with them as well. And he wrote quite a bit of material on Cayce, and so they were around for that first study group, and she knew many members of that study group, but she wasn't one of the original members. So we do still have a few people who were around during his time and who knew him, but they are becoming fewer and far between as the years go on.
I would love to talk to some of them. What would you say are some of the benefits of this type of study group versus maybe another group that's studying the material even on your own?
I think that when you're studying with a group, there's an accountability, because I've done this both ways. When I first started here at the A.R.E., a few years after I had started, there wasn't a study group that worked with my hours, because I worked in the evenings, and so most of them occurred during the evenings. And so I read the material on my own, and then as a study group, most groups will agree to do what we call a discipline or an experiment during the week or the 2 weeks when you're away from each other. And it's basically taking a principle or something that was read in the book and applying it to your daily life. And so I would try to do that on my own, but there wasn't that accountability. There wasn't that responsibility to the group where I knew that I was going to have to go back that next week and give them a report as to how I did on that discipline and whether or not I was successful. Which, the failures sometimes are much more informative than the successes, so it certainly isn't about that, but it was more about, and also there is a camaraderie and a support system there that when, because some of this material is very difficult when you're getting to know yourself on a spiritual level. Sometimes what you see you don't really like. It's not very pretty. And so it's nice to have a group of people who really see you and who are there to support you and say, no, this is just a phase that you're going through, and I've been there too, and, how can I help you? And so it's just, I find, it's a more of a support system when you have the group as opposed to trying to do it on your own. And in terms of how this differs from some of the other groups that you might experience, this really is about applying these principles into your daily life. It's not a cerebral sort of group where you just read the material and you interpret it and you say what your interpretation is. You then take that material and you say, okay, I'm going to apply this in my daily life. I am going to, not react to whatever a person says to me, regardless of whether I feel it's positive or negative. I'm just going to, that's one of the disciplines that we've done recently, that's why I'm mentioning that. I'm just going to pause, and I'm going to see what happens. And it's amazing how such little things, such little behaviors that you can do in your interaction with yourself and with other people can change your whole life dynamic. And I've seen that happen in my own life and in countless others as well.
And I think that's the most important aspect of the book, A Search for God, and these lessons, is that ability and really making it tangible and applying it to real life, really. And Give us let's stay on the lessons, just quote unquote lessons for a few moments. Before, you just mentioned one with cooperation, and you gave an example of how to apply that in real life. Can you give us another example of a lesson and how to apply that in real life?
Well, he was very kind. I was preparing a little bit before we talked and just looking over, and he starts actually the information that they were given started off with meditation and talked about how important it was to have a meditation and a prayer practice as you're working through this material. And the first lesson was cooperation. And then I think that they build, and I think that's also what's really different about these readings is it just doesn't give you this whole list of this laundry list of things that you have to do to be a better person. It slowly builds upon the concepts. And so you start with cooperation, because in the group you're going to have to get along with yourself. And also as you're trying to connect on a spiritual level, and as you learn more about the oneness, there has to be some sort of cooperation. So once that sort of happened and you've sort of signed on for that and you've agreed to cooperate, then it moves into know thyself. And it's talking about more of not just self-exploration, but this is more about your higher self and what your purpose is, and why are you here, and really being able to, one of the readings that he gave was being able to stand aside and walk, being able to stand aside from self, and be able to have that awareness of what your actions are and your thoughts and your attitudes and emotions, and that there's a choice, and that once you know yourself well enough to know what that, and he talked about patterns, and that's where the reincarnation comes in. You have patterns that you've developed, not just in this lifetime. We all think about, this comes from, I do this all the time, this is from my mother. I know that I got this from my mother. And then you go into the readings and it's actually, well, you may have gotten this from your mother, but you also have this from 10,000 years ago when you had this experience. So it's a building of all of these things. And as you get to know yourself better and identify the patterns, then it goes into the chapter about what is my ideal. Now I know myself. I know that I am a spiritual being. Now what am I supposed to do with this knowledge? And so it moves into your ideal, and what is your ideal about, and how do you create an ideal for your life, for your family, and for your group, for your study group, for your job, for any aspect of your life. How do you go about doing that, and how do you apply that ideal in all the aspects of your life? And then after that, it builds upon it, and if you give a lesson on faith, because now that you've put this out into the universe and you say this is my ideal, you have to have the faith and the patience and take the time to see what happens and how that develops. So it's a lovely, there are 2 books. There's actually a book 1 and a book 2, 12 chapters each. So it fits nicely into the year. A lot of the groups will study, take 1 chapter for each month and work with that. And then there are others who take it sentence by sentence, as my group does. We really like to take it slow with the text and really analyze. And a lot of us have read and reread this material. But what's so fascinating about the readings, and particularly the study group material and some of the other lessons that he gave, is it's about where you're approaching it from that moment. And so something that you read even 5 weeks ago has a totally different meaning than what it did to you than it does today. And so you always find something new within the material.
Like any great book, you can come back to it and find a whole nother meaning and interpretation of the material because of where you are at that moment in life.
Right.
And for me, while I'm in the process of going through it and reading the book, if I had to have somewhat of an issue with it, is it has a bit of Christian overtones. It's written a lot with that in mind, in that style. Do you think that does a bit of a disservice for the teachings because it's written with those Christian overtones?
I don't think it does a disservice. I think that that it may, for some people, resonate with them on something that they believe, or that there are certain connotations of an organized religion, sort of, because he uses so much of the biblical references, particularly in the study group readings. But I think that if you, and we do have some modern interpretations. Kevin Tedeschi, who is the CEO, has 12 lessons in personal spirituality, which is a modern interpretation of the first 12 chapters in the Search for God, Book 1. So we do have some modernized versions of it, but I think that if you can get past that and see it more so as this isn't, it certainly isn't a religious text, and particularly because he talks again and again about this God consciousness, and even talks about, there are references to the Buddha and to other religious and spiritual teachers in the readings. But I think that this particular group of readings was given to, again, this particular group of people who at that time were very well versed in the Bible, and so it made sense to them. And for me, I know that I initially had that reaction as well, as, oh my gosh, here I am back in Sunday school, am I going to get a lecture about what, from the sister about, how I didn't fulfill, the goals of what God expected of me. And what I found was, in fact, the opposite, and that it took those scriptures that in some ways seemed very limited, and expanded them and made them and made them applicable to my life. I think in so many ways, the Bible, for me, it's hard for me to apply that in modern life, and I think that this does a good job of interpreting that and turning it into more of, as I said before, the Mark Thurston quote, the character development, and how I can be a better person, and not specifically a better Christian or a better religious person.
And of course, as we said before, the name of the book is A Search for God. I want to know what the reading said about God. Was God defined? Was it a force of nature? Was it an omnipotent being, like so many religions say? How did the readings define God?
It was actually one of my favorite quotes that comes from the prayer group readings, which was given along during this time. There was actually a group of people who were pulled from the study group readings and were given additional readings on how they could use prayer and meditation that they were using daily in studying this material, and how they could use it in healing themselves and others. And so they talked a lot about the source and what the source was. And the initial title, I've been told, for the A Search for God was Man's Search for Truth is Man's Search for God. And so a lot of what he refers to as God as being the truth, and that the truth actually is whatever brings you closer to the divine. So that's another thing that I like to bring forward about the readings, is that it's not a doctrine, it's not something that says you must do this to achieve this. It really is a commentary on the universal spiritual laws and lessons on how to maneuver through those so that you can be a better person, a better soul.
Do we
so
ever...
I think a lot of his talk about God it's both. It's very impersonal in that God doesn't decide. he doesn't decide things for you. A lot of the talk about prayer is that once you say the prayer, there's a submission that you will, the greatest good. We always ask for the highest good as opposed to a laundry list of how we want things to happen. And so I think that there's a fluidity in the Cayce material about how you interpret what your connection is with the divine, and how you go about doing that too. That he gave, even in meditation, everybody that he talked to, he always said that meditation was a great thing, but he always gave everybody a slightly different version of how they might meditate best for themselves at this particular time. So there's an individuality about it that resonates with me as opposed to other material where I've been told that this is how it is.
Karen, how do you, since it is so subjective and individual, how do you define God?
I believe that that what the Cayce material says is true, is that there is one force. There is a universal force that we are all connected to, and we have a free will in terms of whether or not we choose to make that connection, and whether that person's source in this lifetime is nature or Catholicism. The connection is the same. It's and the source is the same. It's just the way that you go about it.
What about you, Leigh? Would you agree with Karen and Cayce's sort of quote-unquote definition of God, or do you have your own?
No, in fact, the Cayce material has helped me come to a better understanding. And I do agree that there is a universal force, a universal creator that we all came from and belong to. And this person, Jesus, who became the Christ, was able to pull that in through his being and the actions that he took and the words that he chose to use and manifest it. And that's available to all of us. And that's what I love about the readings. There's no one that is denied. And it's like Karen said, it's through choice. And we take baby steps and we follow certain paths that resonate with us more clearly, that help us to make the connection. And for me, it's this material.
Two of the goals of the group, the study group, A Search for God, in the beginning was to have the people grow spiritually, and then also to become more psychic. Did the people in the study group, did they actually believe? Obviously, they believed that they grew spiritually, but did they also believe that they became more psychic in a sense? And also talk about in your study groups that you've done as well. Do you feel like you might have become more psychic in a sense, or is that just maybe it's a different connotation that we're putting on psychic or definition?
Well, I was going to say that the interpretation, Cayce would say that psychic really means of the soul. And so as you're becoming more aware of your soul and more aware of yourself as a spiritual being, that you naturally make that connection. And because we're all one, if you're able to plug into that, and you can clearly, and what this material and the study group and a lot of the other readings do, is it helps you sort of clear out all of the static that you might have in terms of your relationship or your interactions with people, and it really lets you focus and be clear. And once you're clear, you're able to tap into that and make a much better decision. And usually that's what people would call, psychic, is that I was able to, interpret what the other person may have wanted or needed at the time, and I was able to fulfill that. And I think that we all have that capacity. Now, whether or not we can all do what Cayce did and tap into the Akashic records, it's a step-by-step process. So we can get closer to it day by day if we use the tools that we're given.
Beautiful. And we only have a couple minutes left, so I want to make sure we touch on a couple more things before I let you go for the evening. How can people find out if there's a group in their area?
They can call Lee. We have an 800 number, which is 800-333-4499, and Lee's extension is 7190. Or they can also email us at study, which is STUDY, at edgarcayce.org, and that email will go directly to Lee as well. And then we also have a web page if you're on that main page, the edgarcayce.org web page. You can go under the events near you, and that will give you a state listing. And we do have quite a few of the groups listed there. If you don't see a group in your area, it doesn't necessarily mean that we don't have one. And I would definitely recommend following up with Lee. And then she can also help you if there's not a group in your area, start a group in your area, which is relatively, it's hard work, but Lee is wonderful at holding hands and getting everyone started.
Wonderful. And of course, is there any limitations? Can anyone start a group?
Anyone can start a group, and we actually have materials. We call it a starter kit that we send out to you that gives you a little bit of information, and then Lee is your resource here. And then we also, depending on where you are in the country, have regional volunteers that may be actually in your area that can assist you as well.
Absolutely wonderful. And before I let you go, just tell us what the A.R.E. is working on right now, and maybe some events that are coming up so people can check it out.
Well, Lee and I are working on a video on explaining a little bit more about what a study group is and how to start a study group. And then we have lots of conferences that are coming up throughout the year. We have an Ancient Mysteries Conference. You had talked about that in October, where we have lots of people that talk about Egypt and things. So I would really recommend getting on the website and seeing what might be happening either here in Virginia Beach or in your local area.
And just give out that social media information one more time.
You can find us on the web at edgarcayce.org. That's EDGARCAYCE.org. Or you can call our customer service line at 800-333-4499. And they'll get you connected either to Lee in the study group department, or if you have other interests, they can connect you with the responsible party here.
Absolutely fascinating stuff. I really appreciate giving the Mind's Eye a piece of your time. Karen Boldt and Leigh Hronek of Edgar Cayce's Association for Research Enlightenment. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I can't wait for the next one.
Oh, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Brian.
Oh, my pleasure. We'll be in touch. We'll be right back for the Mind's Eye Show wrap-up after this quick commercial break. You know what this means, and sadly, it is time for the Mind's Eye Show wrap-up. Quite the enlightening duo, that Karen and Lee. Check out the Association for Research Enlightenment. We have their links up on our social media pages, themindseyemedia.com. Again, themindseyemedia.com. We also have it up on Facebook /Mind's Eye Show and our Twitter handle at Mind's Eye Show. While you're stopping at the website, don't forget to read our hand-picked news articles from politics to paranormal and everything in between. You'll also see info for our next show with guests Mark Vidler and Catherine Young. They're stopping by to discuss their book, Sacred Geometry of the Earth, which reveals how the geography of each continent with the world's ancient monuments represent a form of transglobal communication that far predates the written word. Be well and treat others better. Big thank you to you, the listener. Until the next one, I'm your host, Brian Turnov, and this is the Mind's Eye Show on Z Talk Radio.